And Shabbat Shalom, and welcome back to Shul. This week's portion has a lot, and I'm going to address some of the most interesting things we come across. I might cheat a little bit and go to next week's portion because there's something in there that is so relevant. So forgive me if I jump around just a bit. But obviously, we know what's going on around us, and these are very challenging times and challenging years. And it is possible that the current state will continue, might be extended over the holiday. It makes perfect sense in some way that that's how it would be. There's a lot of chatter and a lot of conversation about what's fair, who should stay open and who should stay closed, and what's right and what's wrong, and I am not an expert. There's a lot of conversation about the change that happened to synagogue life. For us, here at the Shul, the primary narrative has been, please don't reopen. Not that people don't want to come back, not that they don't want to be in their beloved sanctuary and sitting here feeling and connecting and having kiddush and socializing. They understand that would be impossible. That's not possible at this time. So if we did reopen, it would be for davening, for praying only. It would be short. We'd have a little taped square on the floor. You'd stand in your square. You don't move. You wear your mask. You hear the service, and you go home. And for some people, maybe that's what they want. But the majority of people that I've spoken to have said, that's not for me. We're okay. We're okay watching at home. We're okay engaging. We're okay being part of everybody outside of Shul. And when it's time, we will definitely come back and we will definitely appreciate everything more. So in our synagogue, the impetus has been, please don't reopen and force us to make a choice whether we want to come or not. Well, that's why we have the live stream. You don't have to make a choice. You don't have to take a risk. And if you feel so strongly that you must be in a room with 10 other people, well, that's a different congregation, most likely. Here, we are doing what we believe is right and what's best, but other congregations, many Orthodox, of course, and some conservative, feel that they'd like to have in-person services, small as they may be. The Orthodox synagogues, of course, they have a different value system. For them, being in the room, just praying, even in your little green square, is exactly what they want. They could forego all the socializing and the kiddushes and the conversation. They can do that another time. They really want to be in the room. So when the government changed the ruling from 30% of max of capacity in your synagogue or your hall of worship to 10 people in the building, that made it impossible. And that's been an ongoing conversation with the city and the levels of government, and I do want to commend a dear friend and an extraordinarily hard-working person, notwithstanding the fact that some of you think that politicians are subhuman. That's a shame. Getting to know this politician has led me to believe that there are people out there who are devoted to their community and non-stop advocacy for what they believe in. And much of what our dear friend Mike Cole does is advocacy on the most human level. He's now back at City, and he's dealing with people's lives every single day. I just watched the engagement we had about this issue, and his efforts in trying to find some rationale and comfort for all communities is extraordinary. But this is not the Mike Cole show. You can find all about him on his pages and whatever. What this is about is another endeavor that Mike has undertaken, which has borne fruit. No pun intended. He saved a tree. There's a red oak tree in Weston, near the Humber River. And it is Toronto's oldest tree. At least 250 years old, but probably until you cut it down, you won't know for sure. But nobody wants to. It's a beautiful, gorgeous red oak tree, seen as Toronto's oldest. There may be other ones that are older, but it's pretty old. And there's been an effort to save it, but in order to save it and protect it, the city would have to own the property. Finally, Through Mike's efforts and his colleagues, they've raised the funds. The city has agreed to purchase the property and save the tree. You can read all about it everywhere. Now, why is a red oak tree that is really old so important to me today in this week's portion? Actually, this is where I cheat a little bit. It's next week's portion, but it's so important I have to talk about it today. And it's really a conversation about a red oak tree, but ultimately it's about the elderly in our society. It's about the old things in our society. People. It's not about things only, it's about people. It's about trees. It's about living creatures. It's about preserving buildings and heritage. It's about preserving values and traditions. Those are all old things. Very few new things are in need of preservation. It's the old that needs preservation. Why does the old need preservation? Well, I'll tell you. Look at what happened in Toronto in the 70s when they took all those gorgeous heritage buildings, beautiful, beautiful, stunning buildings. Go online and look at Toronto's buildings that were destroyed to make room for brutalist architecture, or perhaps modern architecture, which I'm not the arbiter of what's beautiful and what's not, or what's appropriate and what's not. But what I can tell you is, at some point, people woke up and said, we need to stop this. We're losing all our beautiful buildings. And many of the buildings we have today that are preserved are because of that movement away from the destruction of Toronto's old infrastructure. We're lucky. We have some stunning, stunning buildings preserved. We're also unlucky that some of the most beautiful buildings we had are gone. And sure, there is a balance to be struck between progress, modernity, new trends, new ideas, safety, of course. But luckily, we now have a balance, and now I'm always gratified to see when an old building is preserved, at least the front of it, and sure, you build on top of it, you put glass, steel, aluminum, whatever you put on top, but if you preserve the front, the face of the building, or even the interior, and you build above it, that gives a certain amount of not only dignity to the building, but dignity to the fact that the old is important. I mean, one of the great moments in that kind of preservation was what happened in Yorkville with the old Mount Sinai Hospital. You can go online, you'll see they built an actual system where they could literally put the front wall of the old hospital on a track. And they slid the track out away from the construction site to preserve it. And then when it was done, they moved it back in and they built it back into the building there, and you can go there and see it. It looks like the front of the old Mount Sinai. Some of you might have been born there, right? We're talking about some of you who are older. And all this, of course, you can look up in the Torah of Google and so on. So preserving the old is often because the old needs preservation. It's just easy to knock things down and raise existing buildings and build brand new. It's probably much more expensive to incorporate the old into the new, but that's what we're doing, and it has to be done. And I'm glad that we're preserving heritage buildings. It makes it hard. I looked at something up in the Niagara Escarpment, and the problem with the Niagara Escarpment, other than all the great parts of it, is that if you want to build something there, it's almost impossible. They have a plan. They barely let you build. Right? There's a reason for it, because they want to preserve it. So sometimes to preserve, you have to stop adding. Today, we are talking about preserving the old. So that oak tree, thank goodness, will survive. Beautiful red oak. And in the Parsha that I'm referring to, it's chapter 35 in Genesis, so it's a week ahead. There's this incredible story that is an anomaly. It just doesn't fit in. It's an oddity. Jacob has just finished his war, his almost war with his brother. He escapes. He's now got other traumas. He's got all kinds of things going on. The rape of Dinah, the slaughter of Shechem, and so on. And he's now a persona non grata, and he has to find, now again he's on the move, and he's once again escaping. And in the middle of all that, we have this text. Vatamas Devora Meinekes Rivka Vatikaber Mitachatz Levesel Tachas Ha'alon Vatikra Shemo Alon Bachus. In between all the comings and goings, Rebekah's nurse, Deborah, died. And she was buried in the valley of Bethel under the oak. It was named Weeping Oak, Alon Bachus. And then it just goes on to Jacob's journeys and so on and so forth. What is the story of Rebekah, of the nurse of Rebekah? You know how old that must have been? Jacob was probably in his 60s. His mother's nurse comes to visit him, and she dies while she's there. Devorah. And she's buried under this tree. She must have been ancient. And what's it doing in the story? Most of the time, we have no reference to the help in the house, unless it's Hagar who turns from a help into a wife. Typically, we don't know the names of the servants. We barely even know the names of the wives or daughters of families. We know nothing. And here is a sentence devoted to the nurse of his mother, like the caregiver of his mother, Julia, who took care of his mom when she was between ages 1 and 3. 90 years later, she died, and the text makes a whole story out of it, under a big oak and with a name. It's pretty extraordinary. And I know why. I know why. I know that the Torah is a strange place in which to learn about life. The Torah, for many people, is a book of law, and it's clearly not. It's guidance. For many people, the Torah is a book of stories, and it's clearly not. It's therapy. And for many people, the Torah is absurd. It's definitely not. It's way too complicated to be swatted away just by saying it's irrelevant or absurd. It's not true. And when you see a passage like this, you need to delve really deeply. This is a moment in which the Torah stops itself from belonging to its time in which it exists, and it puts down a root for something that it expects will resonate forever. And what is that root? It's pretty obvious to see that the root initially is when someone who is critical to your success and your life in your early years dies, you pay tribute. You acknowledge it. Even if it was fleeting, even if it wasn't your nurse, even if it was your mother's nurse, you pay attention to that. You bury them, particularly if they were still helping you. The Midrash tells us what was Devorah, this elderly woman, doing, chasing Jacob across the plains of Abraham at her age. And the answer is, Rebekah had said to Jacob, one day when things settle with you and your brother, I will send for you and bring you back. And here she was sending for him through Deborah, and Deborah was supposed to bring him back. She was still on her mission, which also teaches us that age is not a barrier to usefulness. Age is not a barrier to mission. Age is not a barrier to significance and relevance. And Jacob, despite all his challenges with women and understanding who was right and who was wrong and what is right and what is wrong, he understood that the nurse of his mother was his life force. Ultimately, it made him who he was. And when she was still on her mission, he perpetuated that by turning her mission in life into a mission in death, which was to be a tree, which would provide shade, which would provide refuge, which would provide a signifying point where people could gather under its shade. It was an oak, and an oak gives shade, and perhaps the roots find water, and maybe there's water nearby. Jacob understood perpetuating one's mission in life should be continued in death. Now that story, that little story about perpetuating the mission is timeless. It's no longer the Bible as we know it. It's the best wisdom we have. That is why sometimes, for example, our dear friend Joe Fox passed away suddenly and way too young, alava shalom. And what did we do for Joe? Joe was an outdoorsman. He loved the outdoors. So on the front lawn of our shul, there's a blue spruce pine. You can go see it. It has a little plaque in the ground. We planted a tree for Joe because Joe lives on in his genre in nature. And everyone who benefits by some older person has an obligation to keep their mission going and be grateful. And that's why I want to talk today about the elderly. Ask yourself, young people, you decide if you're young or old, it's up to you. If the roles were reversed and the people that were most vulnerable to this pandemic were children or teenagers or millennials, let's say it was you. Let's say the virus takes a left turn and suddenly old people, nothing. Couldn't care less. Old people have some kind of nucleotides that make them immune. Just the virus morphed, I don't know. And now suddenly it's children or young people. What do you think our parents and grandparents would do for us? Everything. Absolutely everything. Yeah, probably some old people out there who wouldn't, but for the most part, absolutely everything. Well, it's our turn now. We can do what we know they would do, and that is everything. There is nothing more difficult right now than people not seeing their families. There's nothing else. Everything would be okay. We could live through this pandemic much more easily if we could just see our friends and family, particularly our parents and grandparents. But just reverse the roles for 1 second. This is the story of Jacob burying his mother's nurse under a beautiful tree and making that effort for her because the roles were reversed. It was his turn now. We hope in the future, and the rabbis teach us in the Messianic age, we have Yom Shekulo Shabbat, a day which is entirely Shabbat, or days that are entirely Shabbat. And in some ways, pandemic and lockdown is making it Yom Shekulo Shabbat. It's a day we have to extend the amount of rest we take. We cannot be doing everything we want. There is nowhere to go. There's nowhere to be. This is the year in which we will not get everything we want. That is clear. But it's the year in which we can be appreciative for everything we have. It's a long Shabbat. And it's also just like the Haftorah of this week's portion says, Kichu imachem devarim v'shuvu el Adonai. Take with you words or things or ideas and return to God. And the way I understand that verse in this moment, all you have now is the ability to communicate. Take your words and return yourself to what's basic and spiritual. Keep in touch with people. Don't lose touch. Assume that this will be over. Assume that it will be over, and assume that young people do understand about taking care of the elderly, and assume that good people understand about respecting traditions and values, and assume that the same way we want to preserve trees, we want to preserve people. And assume as well that the healthcare system in this country and in this province needs an entire overhaul when this is done. It is unconscionable. It is unconscionable. I'm not talking about people doing bad things. I'm talking that we as a society have not made aging safer. We could do a lot more. We did it for the handicapped, disabled. We should do it there as well. I'm not an expert on that either. But if you read the reports, you understand there's a lot of work to be done. And everybody agrees, and it's time to get to it. They would do anything for us if it was about young people. So just to understand, going back to the weeping oak of Devorah, the nurse of Rivka, that happens approximately the year 2100, somewhere around there. Almost 1,000 years later, a brilliant female judge arises in the land of Israel. And her name was Devorah. Devorah the prophetess. Devorah the judge. Devorah was the single greatest figure in Jewish life at that point. Devorah, same name as the nurse of Rebekah. Vihi yoshevet tachat tomer Devorah. And she used to sit under the tree of Devorah. And the Midrash tells us, that's right, you got it. That is the same tree that Jacob planted for Devorah. This woman, Devorah, who became the prophetess and judge and leader of the Jewish people, that was where she made her headquarters, under the tree of Devorah. Maybe she was inspired by Devorah. Maybe she was inspired by a woman who carried out her mission until her very last breath. Maybe she was inspired by a woman, Devorah, who wouldn't give up and kept multi-generational relationships going. And Devorah the prophetess too. She served the people of Israel for 60 years. Imagine the leader of the Jewish world for 60 years was Devorah, a woman. Together with Gideon's reign after her of 48 years, plus another 40 years, they had over 100 years of peace in the land. Under Deborah's rule, there were some wars. She quelled them. She fought battles. And then there was peace. What happened to all the women leaders? Well, even if they're not found in the religious world, they're found all over the place. Without addressing the political side of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there was a judge of Israel. Golda Meir was a judge of Israel. These were leaders of people. And it exists. And for some strange reason, a lot of people have come to believe that Jewish women were never leaders in the classic sense in Jewish life. And that's false. That's a narrative that is about circular reasoning. And here's the circular reasoning we hear. Why shouldn't Jewish women be rabbis? Why shouldn't Jewish women be leaders in their community? Well, they haven't been leaders for a very long time. Why not? Because they probably shouldn't be. Why shouldn't they be? Because they haven't been. Well, if they haven't been, why should they be? Let's not change. They haven't been for whatever reason. All the wisdom of the generation says they haven't been. Therefore, they shouldn't be. That is circular reasoning, and guess what? It's false. The reason women weren't leaders is because they weren't allowed to be leaders. But when women were leaders, they were extraordinarily successful. We have two Devorahs that attest to that. And they follow a chain and a link. They end up under the same tree. One is buried under the tree, and one saved her people from that tree. So friends, this is a time when if you feel well, be grateful. If your children are well, be grateful. If you're well, and everybody you know is well, and I've started to hear, Rabbi, I don't know people who died from COVID. Well, I do, a lot. Yes, most of them were old. So what? Now we have more responsibility. It is our duty as young people who are less vulnerable to do everything in our power to protect the elderly in our society. It's your job not to kill anyone. It is your job to save 250-year-old trees, to save 100-year-old buildings, to preserve what is most important in your life. It is really important to preserve our heritage. Kal vachomer, how much more so to preserve our history and living tradition called the elderly in our society. If you're not prepared to protect other people, truly, truly stay home. If you are prepared to protect other people, go out safely. If you want to be ultimately responsible for hurting other people, ask yourself, would they hurt you? There's never been a better time to invoke one of the most powerful passages in the entire Torah. Again, not a passage about law, not a passage about stories, but about deep, divine, human, therapeutic change. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your friend as you love yourself. That is a minimum standard. You want to know what you wouldn't do to someone else? If someone would come to your house and give you a disease, you wouldn't be happy. Don't do it to anyone else. Friends, I believe there's good news coming. I believe the future holds a vaccine. Despite all the grumbling of when it arrives, it will be here. It's extraordinary that we're even capable of producing and changing this disease. It is extraordinary that our society, for the most part, continues and carries on the best way it can. We are incredibly resilient. But don't forget that we all bear the responsibility to make sure that something about the journey through COVID is also meaningful and appropriate and right and good and an opportunity for change. Let's not just focus only on the destination. Let's be kind until we get there. Shabbat Shalom.